the Executive Director of the National Japanese American Historical Society. Welcome to Labor Fest. I'm going to go ahead and not start any, I'd like to welcome you for a beautiful day today. We have wonderful discussions, excellent speakers, and we'll get started right away. And I'd like to introduce Harvey Schwartz from Labor Fest. Thank you.
Of Labor Fest. Labor Fest runs for an entire month. There's approximately one event, sometimes even more, for each day in July. And so this is the opening day of Labor Fest. It's kind of like the opening day of the baseball season. It's July 1.
I hope we do better than the Giants.
So we hope we do better than the Giants. Chuck has amended my comment. Okay, first of all, our first speaker, regarding the problem of the internment camps during World War II, our first speaker is Charles Wollenberg. Just to let you know a little bit about Charles. He's completing a book now about Wayne Collins, who is a lawyer who defended a number of Japanese Americans during the Second World War. Most famously, Fred Korematsu. Case went to the Supreme Court. Fred was in prison and they refused to attend the camps or to show up for the camps. And Chuck's going to discuss Collins' defense of Japanese American rights and how Collins helped enable Japanese Americans' own protests and activism, laying the foundation for the Japanese American Redress movement that ultimately won reparations and a formal apology from the federal government for the incarceration of citizens of Japanese American background during the Second World War. Chuck has taught at Berkeley City College for a long time. He was chair of the Social Studies Department. His many books include All Deliberate Speed, Segregation and Exclusion in California Schools, 1855 to 1975, Golden Gate Metropolis, Perspectives on Bay Area History, Photographing the Second Gold Rush, Dorothea Lange and the Bay Area at War, 1941 to 1945. So he knows a lot about the Second War, obviously. And Marine Ship at War, Shipbuilding and Social Change in Wartime, Sausalito, and most recently, Berkeley, A City History. Please welcome Chuck. Thank you.
Fred Korematsu, who
Maybe just hold it. You want to
maybe
just hold it?
yeah. One thing that is that better? One thing that Fred Korematsu, about whom Laura is going to speak, and at least 300 of the Japanese Peruvians about whom Grace is going to speak, one thing they had in common was their lawyer was Wayne Collins. Collins, I think you could argue, was the most important lawyer defending or trying to defend the rights and liberties of people of Japanese descent during and immediately after World War II. And I think because of that, he may be the most important civil rights lawyer that almost no one knows anything about, or at least almost no one outside of this room knows anything about. He was, when the war started, he was in his early 40s. He was a private attorney here in San Francisco with a modestly successful practice, but his real passion was civil rights and civil liberties. He'd been one of the organizers of the Northern California branch of the American Civil Liberties Union that was established in 1934, and it was through that connection and his connection with Ernest Bessig, the legendary director of the Northern California branch, that Collins became involved in the Japanese American cases. He was involved in several cases. The three that I'm going to just briefly mention, because I don't have much time, are the Korematsu case, the renunciant case, and the case of so-called Tokyo Rose. In the Korematsu case, as Harvey has said, Collins took that case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court and used that case to challenge the basic constitutionality of Executive Order 9066 and the removal of incarceration that followed. He lost the case. In 1944, the court, by a 6-3 margin, voted that at least the executive order and the incarceration the executive order and the removal, but maybe not the incarceration, were constitutional, and that still is precedent. But almost 40 years later, in 1983, 9 years after Wayne Collins had died, District Judge Marion Hall Patel here in San Francisco overturned the original conviction of Fred Korematsu, and did it in part using the same arguments, even almost the same language that Wayne Collins had used in the original case in the 1940s. So, and we can talk more about the specifics of that, but I think of that almost as a posthumous victory for Wayne Collins. It happened 9 years after his death, but it was based on the arguments that he was making from the very beginning. The renunciant case involved 5,000 people who were imprisoned at the Tule Lake camp in northeastern California who renounced their American citizenship. And it was due to just terrible conditions, chaotic conditions at the Tule Lake camp, which again, we don't really have time to discuss here. But in the summer of 1945, the federal government said, okay guys, since you have voluntarily renounced your American citizenship, you are now enemy aliens and you will be deported to the United States, to Japan rather, from the United States. The people got together and formed what they called the Tule Lake Defense Committee and looked for a lawyer. And really, at least initially, the only lawyer who would take their case was Wayne Collins. He stayed on that case for 23 years. It was not until 1968 that the last vestiges of that case were completed. But during that 23-year period, he prevented anybody from being involuntarily deported. And in the end, he managed to restore the citizenship for about 95% of the plaintiffs in that case. The so-called Tokyo Rose case involved a woman named Iva Toguri de Aquino, who had been born and raised in Southern California, and in 1941 went to Japan to take care of a ill aunt and got caught there when the war started. And the Japanese government required her to make English language broadcasts on Radio Tokyo. When the war was over, the United States charged her with treason, even though there is no evidence that she said anything treasonous in these broadcasts. Wayne Collins defended her in a 13-week court case that took place here in San Francisco. And in the end, she was convicted to some degree on the basis of perjured testimony. And she served 6 years in federal prison. When she got out, the government tried to deport her. Collins prevented the deportation. And for the rest of his life, he was trying to get the original conviction overturned, either by judicial means or by presidential pardon. And he was trying to do that literally when he died in 1974. In 1977, 3 years after his death, Iva Toguri did receive a pardon from President Gerald Ford. I believe she's the only person in American history to have been convicted of treason to have received a full pardon, an unconditional pardon, a pardon that fully restored her citizenship. One of the things that's interesting about all three of those cases is that Collins, in his position, was opposed by the national leadership of the American Civil Liberties Union and also by the national leadership of the Japanese American Citizens League. When Collins went to the Supreme Court representing Fred Korematsu, he did so also representing the Northern California branch of the American Civil Liberties Union, not the American Civil Liberties Union. And the division that, or the conflict that occurred between the national office and the San Francisco office caused by that case continued on for another 25 or 30 years. Some of you who maybe are old ACLU members are aware of that. The JACL was particularly adamant about not providing any assistance to the renunciants or to so-called Tokyo Rose, considering them to be virtual traitors. Yet Collins, in effect, then was not only fighting against the federal government, but was fighting against groups that you would otherwise have assumed would be sympathetic to his case. In the late 1960s, a new generation of JACL leaders tried to kind of make amends by inviting Collins to a dinner on his behalf. And he not only turned down the invitation, but he said the best thing that the JACL could do for Japanese Americans would be to immediately disband. And he said, as far as he was concerned, JACL stood for jackal. Wayne Collins, whatever he was not a gentle person. He did not believe in turning the other cheek. As he himself admitted, I never forgive and I never forget. And part of his personality that we really can't go into now was he had anger management problems, to put it mildly. But I think, and as Harvey has said, I think his main role was not so much as the savior of Japanese Americans, but an enabler of Japanese Americans. Enabled people to begin to organize their own campaigns for justice and redemption. And even, for example, during that renunciant case, as it went on, the Tule Lake Defense Committee took on more and more and more responsibility for the case. And I think you could argue that it was a case that was jointly won by Wayne Collins and the Defense Committee. When Iva Taguri got her pardon, it was because of a campaign led primarily by Japanese Americans, along with Wayne Collins' son, and along with Iva herself, who became a very important person supporting her own cause. And when the court case went to Judge Patel here in San Francisco to overturn Fred Korematsu's conviction, again, it was Japanese American attorneys who brought that case. And of course, it was the long campaign in 1988 that resulted in the law passed by Congress, signed by President Reagan, that provided the $20,000 reparations payment for almost all of those people who were still alive, who had suffered the removal and incarceration. It didn't include the Japanese Peruvians, for example. But in that law, there was also, in the body of the law, there was language that in effect said that Executive Order 9066 was unnecessary, unconstitutional, and was motivated not by concerns of national security, but by racism and political expediency. Wayne Collins believed so much in the Constitution that he was willing to directly take on the authority of an extremely popular and powerful president of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, commander-in-chief during World War II. And in the end, Collins was right and Roosevelt was wrong. And I think that's the precedent, that's the legacy of Wayne Collins. That's a precedent and a legacy that's so important today. I mean, in an era of President Donald Trump and Attorney General Jeff Sessions, the real question is, where is Wayne Collins when we really, really need him again? So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chuck. We're going to hold questions to the end because we have kind of a full schedule today, so hold our questions to the end. Our next speaker is Laura Atkins. Laura is the author with Stan Yogi of Fred.
Thank you. Oh, I don't know if this one's working. Oh, is that not a lift-up one? Okay. Oh, I see, for the recording. All right, let's see if this works. Does this work? Yes. Okay. I'm going to stand up so that I can show you guys. You won't be able to see a lot from back there, but some of the book that Stan Yogi and I co-authored. As Harvey said, it's called Fred Korematsu Speaks Up, published by Heyday Books in Berkeley, nonprofit publisher, and it's the first in the Fighting for Justice series. Aimed at middle grade readers. We had kind of fourth graders in mind, though we've been speaking quite a lot to 5th to 8th grade, I'd say primarily. Fourth grade because it fits into the curriculum that they study California history. And the book released on January 30th, which is Fred Korematsu Day of Civil Liberties and the Constitution, and sold out in about a month. They printed 3,000 copies, so we've sort of unfortunately benefited from what's going on in the world. But it is also an important story to tell. Karen Korematsu, Fred Korematsu's daughter, was involved, and Ken, her brother, so it was very much sort of created in a collaborative spirit to make sure that we were telling his story well. I thought what I would do is sort of show you how the book works a little bit and then tell you a bit about what it's been like to share it with kids, which we've done quite a lot of. So in thinking about how to put the book together for that young readership, As Chuck was just saying, the legal stuff can actually get quite technical and complicated. So thinking, how do we, tell the story of what happened, but make it so that young readers can kind of follow and feel engaged and also get the larger sense of why is it important now to speak up when you feel like something is wrong. So the decision that we made was to tell the story in a few ways. One is focusing on Fred Korematsu's biography, which we did in free verse, short lines on the page, and that partially happened. We got feedback from one librarian in particular from West Contra Costa County who said, it's great if it's for fourth graders, but if you could write it even below that reading level, she has so many kids who can't read at fourth grade level. So I think part of our thinking was, how can we write this in a really accessible way so that readers can access it, but that will also work for older readers too. So I'll read you the first one. The illustrations are by Yutaka Hulett, who's an Oakland-based artist who did a fantastic job. I think there's a few copies here, so afterwards you guys can take a look and see it close up. First poem is called Getting a Haircut. Fred's hair needs cutting. His friends have the snazziest styles, short and sharp, slicked down and combed back, all the rage. Up until now, Fred's mother has cut his hair. Straight, simple. Fred wants to get his hair cut by a real barber. He walks into his local barber shop. The waxy smell of pomade oil mingles with the sound of snipping scissors. Hey boy, what do you want? The barber says. I just want to get a haircut, Fred tells him. We don't cut hair of your kind. Why? Because Fred's parents are from Japan. The barbershop won't serve people who look like Fred. Fred knows this isn't fair. He has as much right to that haircut as any of his friends. Fred walks out past other barbershops that will not cut his hair and restaurants that will not serve him food. He goes to Oakland's Chinatown, where people who look like Fred are welcome. He gets his hair cut in the latest style, just like his friends. And part of our thinking with starting with that scene, Elizabeth Partridge, who some of you may know as the goddaughter of Dorothea Lange, who took a lot of the really key pictures that we have from what happened. She was my advisor. I did an MFA program at Vermont College of Fine Arts, and she also writes great nonfiction. And I was sort of talking to her about how do we kind of start this book and help kids to really engage with it now. And she said, you got to start with a haircut. Because she said, kids do that. They go and get their haircut. So it's in this really immediate sort of something that they can relate to then, think, what is it like to face that kind of discrimination? But then what we wanted to do to get at the more kind of extended or technical pieces of the story is we have what we call historical insets. So after each one of the poems, they're sort of image-rich. This one focuses on discrimination, since that's what the poem focused on. And we have a picture of him when he's young. We have questions for young readers, like, have you ever been treated badly because of how you look or speak? Definitions of terms. And in sharing the book with young people, we focused on this first inset, which is a little hard to see, but there's pictures of different groups in our nation's history who have faced discrimination. So we have actually a cartoon of an Irish immigrant looking like a Frankenstein monster. And when Stan and I do presentations, we sort of tag team back and forth. So he does this section, but he'll say, if you were an immigrant here from Ireland 150 years ago, you would have been seen as the unwanted immigrant group. People were seen as lazy and violent. There's a picture of a Chinese miner during the gold rush being attacked by a white miner, and he'd said, people were coming from all over the world to get rich, but this is how people from China were seen, and it was because people felt threatened, and he talks about the Chinese Exclusion Act. So we're really making an effort to connect to thinking about our history as a nation and who has faced discrimination, which immigrant groups have been targeted. And then we go through it, and it tells what happened, as we heard with Fred Korematsu's case going up to the Supreme Court, where he lost, and then him reopening his case. We've shared the book now with over 4,000 young people, mostly in the Bay Area, also in Los Angeles. We frame it, so Stan starts, he shows a picture of himself when he's about 10 years old and asks the kids, who do you think this is? Often they'll think it's Fred Korematsu. Some kid might say, oh, it's a color picture, so it couldn't be, or, it looks like you. And he'll say, yes, and, when I was 10, I liked to play basketball. I loved to roller skate. And he said, but I also learned something about my family. And he shows a picture of a young woman graduating and says, what do you think is happening here? She's graduating. He says, yes, this is my mother. But she graduated not from any normal high school, but from a high school in a prison camp in the California desert. Why do you think my mother went to high school, was sent to a prison camp? So getting the kids, again, to think about it in this immediate way of someone that's right there in front of them who faced it. And then I talk about how I grew up with a family of activists, including my mother, who's in the audience, and show pictures of my dad at a protest at Kezar Stadium, and my mom and her wife singing as part of a protest, and then myself getting arrested in high school at a blockade of Lawrence Livermore Labs, and then show a newspaper article that says, of the 65 protesters arrested, 10 of them were Berkeley High School students. And I say, something that I learned is that when you're a young person and you speak up, sometimes people pay attention. And then we come back to that at the end of the presentation, and Stan talks about why Fred Korematsu is really one of his heroes, and that he saw him when he was a student at UCLA, and he said he could have been his uncle. He said he's not a big man or a tall man or a loud man, and Stan's not big or tall or loud, but that he showed him that when you speak up for something that you believe in, you can really make a difference. And we have in sharing, we were at Davis at the Fred Korematsu Elementary School, which is the first school that was named for him. And when we were done, 3 fifth-grade girls came up to us and told us that their mosque had been vandalized. But they told us not with shame, but with pride, because they had worked with their teacher and their school community to raise money to help pay for repairs. And so for them, something that was and could be terrible was also an opportunity to show that they could bring community together. So we've had the opportunity to see a lot of Bay Area schools that are doing amazing work with young people to think about and talk about how they can speak up and creative ways that they can do it. And at the end of the book, we have an activist spread with sort of tips for kids and resources. And we say in presentations, we would love it if you would share this with us and we can put it on our website so other young people can see it and share it. So hopefully the book and the series are really helping to inspire and show young people that they do have a voice and it's important to speak up, as we just heard, especially now. So I'll stop there and happy at the end to answer any questions, but thank you.
I can even wave a copy. It's called The Union Combats Racism, the ILWU's Japanese American Stockton Incident of 1945. Well, at that time, in what was kind of an unusual situation, the Longshore Union stood up for the Japanese Americans, and in some ways it was unique in the whole society, and also as far as the labor movement was concerned. So I will describe as I go along the Longshore Union stance toward the camps during World War II, and try to suggest its relevance. I've done a couple of books on the longshoremen. One of them is called Solidarity Stories. There's a copy over for sale over there. It does have one chapter on Hawaii and the organization of thousands of Japanese and Filipino workers, thousands and thousands during the latter part of World War II. Let's see. 1 second here. I've got the right paper. You always have to get the right paper. Oops. Okay. First of all, what is the International Longshore and Warehouse Union? Just to let you know who these folks were and are. It's a progressive West Coast union. It emerged from the 1930s organizing drive, which is part of what was going on in the United States. Way of organizing, which in some ways was like the civil rights movement, and the fact that there was a lot of passion and excitement. The union won a big strike on the West Coast in 1934 to get recognition and get a contract with the employers. There was also a protest strike, very famous in 1934, over the killing in July on July 5th of a couple of waterfront workers by the San Francisco police force who were working with the employers. The union is associated with its leader who emerged during the Great Strike. His name is Harry Bridges. How many people have heard of Harry Bridges? Oh my, that's great. You never know nowadays, because as time goes by, young people don't get this information in very many places. Well, Bridges put his stamp on the union, and it's still really there, I think. No discrimination for race, ethnicity, religion, political persuasion. It's driven by the opinion of workers. That is to say, it practices what's called union democracy. Almost everything gets voted on, contracts, officers, not indirectly but directly. Worker dignity and representation on the job is key, as important as it is for all unions, actually. This union practices clean governments. There's no corruption. None of this is quite perfect. Every now and then there's some little problem, which I could go into in great depth, but don't need to at this point. It has a long tradition, the Union of progressivism, progressive stance, social justice, left politics, civil rights, and so forth throughout its history. Let's look at the ILWU and its activity in practice during the 1930s through 1945. First of all, there was organizing. This was a CIO organization. The CIO emerged in the mid-1930s, and the West Coast Union was on the West Coast and in Hawaii. It was really the driving force behind the CIO at that time. 1938 in Hilo in Hawaii, there was a big strike. Several people were shot, something like 50, as I recall. Nobody actually died, but they were shot. It was called the Hilo Massacre. There's a German organizing drive, and the West Coast Union folks were behind that. Well, when FDR's Executive Order 9066 came down, it was supported, as I noted, by most unions and most institutions in society, with the exception of a few folks like Collins, but not the ILWU. The international, well, there was a guy named Louis Goldblatt, who was the Secretary-Treasurer of the CIO Industrial Union Council. He was really on loan from the ILWU, and he spent the bulk of his career from 43 until 77 as Secretary-Treasurer of the International Longshore and Warehouse Union. In the union, he's a famous figure, in terms of fame, right? Although Harry is more widely known throughout the world. When the camps were being discussed, there was a U.S. Senate committee that was formed. It was called the Select Committee Investigating National Defense Migration of the United States House of Representatives. Well, okay, migration. Gee, are these folks going to move because they want to? A fancy government name, bureaucratic name, for forcing everybody into these concentration camps. This is what Lou Goldblatt said when he spoke before the Select Committee Investigating National Defense Migration of the United States House of Representatives. Louis said, and I had the privilege of knowing him to some degree. He died in the 1980s. He said, state and local officials, rather than standing as bastions of justice and equal protection under the law, have joined the hue and cry against the Japanese native born. He went on, the forces of hysteria and vigilantism had won out over decency. And he went further. He said, this entire episode of mob chant will form a dark page of American history. I think he got that one right. It may well appear as one of the great victories won by the Axis powers. The Axis powers were Nazi Germany and its allies, including Japan at that time. Well, the Union looked at the situation in the 1943 convention that they held. They have a convention where everybody up and down the West Coast, the Union's jurisdiction is California, Oregon, Washington, now Hawaii, even Alaska now, and also in Panama now. They had the International Convention. That means everybody meets representatives from all these places. They passed a resolution officially condemning discrimination in 1943. They repeated that in their convention in 1945. Well, during 1944 to 1945, in Hawaii, the Union was organizing thousands, as I noted, more than over 25,000, it's probably closer to 30. These were Japanese and Filipino field workers for the most part, and cannery workers. So a big organizing drive going on. So they're doing that. Just to give you an idea of what the Japanese Americans themselves were doing in the islands in conjunction with the Longshore Unit. This is, for example, a guy named Hiroshi Oshiro, who said, he described the organizing drive. Guys like Hashimoto and Shiro Hokama went house to house and signed up people. Hashimoto had a lot of guts. You don't just go out and try to organize a union on these islands where everything was controlled by the company. And the company's treatment of the workers was very poor, but we don't have a lot of time for that. Q&A session, maybe. Well, in 1945, Harry Bridges was working with the War Relocation Authority, trying to get people released from the camps, jobs. And his argument was, we can send people through our hiring hall and you folks can get jobs, because nobody else is going to hire the Japanese Americans during, the war is still on. This is during the period, the war was still on. Well, in Stockton, California, there was a unit called the Stockton Unit, And they refused to let the internees go through the hiring hall to get jobs. And I wrote that article on that some years ago. And this is what one person who said, who was a Japanese guy in background, his name is Manahu Tanaku. He wrote, "I've learned much about democratic unions. I hope I will not have to unlearn what I have been taught, that the ILWU, above all unions, respects the rights of minorities." So Bridges was rather upset. He and some of the officers drove up from San Francisco to Stockton, and Harry personally tore the chapter, the charter of the Stockton Union off the wall and said, "You guys are suspended. This is against the Constitution of the ILWU." Well, make a long story short, the Stockton folks reversed this, and the guys went to work for the hiring hall. A little tiny bit about payback. In 1947-48, when the Cold War was going on, Cold Warriors attacked the ILWU in Hawaii. So Goldblatt called a special meeting, and he said, "We're all going to vote as to whether we're going to stay in the Union." And all the Japanese voted to stay in the Union, so they stayed in the Union. In one sense, that's the payback by the Japanese Americans. And by the way, that local in Hawaii is still the biggest and strongest in the Union. A little bit about lessons for today. Well, you have to stay vigilant against things like this. Things like this could occur again. There's no question but that the current administration in Washington would do something like this again if they thought there was political capital to be made, if they thought they could use the fear factor for whatever, whether it's Mexicans or Muslim, whoever it might be, hey, if we can make political hay, doing this, I think they would move to do it. And these folks don't appear to be as kindly in their worldview as Franklin Roosevelt was. So I think you have to be vigilant today for things like this. Okay, our last speaker is Larry Yamamoto, and Larry is a camp survivor, a retired longshoreman.
Just want to say thank you all for coming, and then also thanks to Labor Fest for inviting me to participate on this panel. I really appreciate the recognition that's being given to the 75th anniversary of Executive Order 9066, what that meant in terms of the wartime experience for our community, but also the inclusion of the Japanese Latin Americans in that history and the ongoing struggle, and then what all that means for today's situation. So, but before I get into my spiel, I just wanted to do a check-in of how many folks kind of already have heard the story of the Japanese Latin Americans? Oh, great. Thank you very much. So, and then, do you mind showing me, because I can't see too good without my glasses, and they can't see far away. How many, maybe this is the first time that you're hearing about it? Okay, thanks. Okay, so I'll just let you know what the challenge I face. I got 10 minutes, to go over the history, give you an update on a current redress struggle, and then begin to open up some sense of what are the lessons for today. So and then I arrived late, so I didn't have time to Xerox off some handouts, but I'll do that later so that you can get some information around the history too to take home with you. But basically, in the United States, people have heard about the Japanese American incarceration, and that's largely in part due to the hard work of the Japanese American community and their growing recognition among other sectors, that this was one of the worst constitutional violations in U.S. history. What people don't still know about is that the United States also targeted other groups of people as the enemy during the war, particularly the Germans and Italians. And they have an internment story as well that is not well known. And then on top of that, the United States government went to Latin America and kidnapped over 6,000 men, women, and children of Japanese, German, Italian, and 81 Jewish people, and brought them to the United States, interned them for indefinitely, and without charge or trial. And then many of them were used in hostage exchange. So in total, we would say that when Pearl Harbor happened, maybe about in the United States, immediately over 1 million people of German, Japanese, Italian ancestry became targeted as the enemy. And then, and in total, over 31,000 enemy aliens of German, Italian, and Japanese ancestry in the United States and from Latin America were apprehended, detained, and interned for reasons of national security. And of these, over 6,000 were folks from Latin America. And so people have heard about the 10 War Relocation Authority camps where most of the Japanese Americans were incarcerated. Well, surprise, there's over 50 other facilities run by the Department of Justice, the prison system, the Army, that held other so-called enemy aliens. And most of them were potentially dangerous enemy aliens. So it wasn't like they had charges against them when they were apprehended. And so then it's like during the war for people of Japanese ancestry, there were 2 hostage exchanges that took place. But then these were called to a stop because Japan started complaining that, oh, we're getting people that don't want to be brought here, you know? And then also the United States needed the ships for the war effort. So for the people of Japanese ancestry, it stopped. But we still had people being taken from Latin America until 1945. And then for Germans, we know at least of 5 exchanges that took place using people that were interned in the United States and sent to Europe for the exchange. But now we're uncovering other stuff around direct shipments from Latin America to Europe. So we really don't know for the Germans how many people were used in this way. So at the end of the war then, it's like you have these camps with these enemy aliens, and then the United States says, well, especially to the folks from Latin America, we now consider you illegal aliens because you entered the country illegally. Even though we brought you here, you're illegal entrants. So we need to rid the Western Hemisphere of these enemies, you know. And so at the end of the war for people of Japanese ancestry from Latin America, about 900 of us were deported, but 300 or so fought to remain in the United States, many with the idea of returning home to Latin America, and that was with the help of Wayne Collins. But as it turns out, initially the countries didn't want the Japanese to come back, even if they were citizens of those countries or married to citizens of those countries. So eventually only 100 were able to kind of go back in that initial period. And then, so for the most part, the folks that stayed in the United States were here as illegal aliens and had to figure out how to survive, how to integrate into whatever communities. And most of them integrated into the Japanese American community or into Spanish-speaking communities. So let's see, okay. So then, you know, when the redress effort happened, you know, our family said, oh, this is good, you know, because we were in some of the same camps where there were Japanese Americans. Maybe we'll get redress too. And so some of us were able to testify at the commission hearings. And a reference was made in the personal justice denied, the recommendations for redress. But we were excluded, which points to how the government, while it says it wants to redress wrongs, it also strives to restrict how much the scope of the redress is. And so for Japanese Latin Americans, for the most part, we were denied that type of redress. And so we ended up trying to talk to the White House to see if there could be some executive way that we could get covered. But they said pretty much, sorry, but you're going to have to sue us. So that's what we did. We eventually had 5 lawsuits, one of them culminating in the controversial Mochizuki settlement that called for, an apology that doesn't really mention the word Japanese or Latin America, and it doesn't really talk about the scope of the violations, but it did say the government did wrongdoing. And that meant a lot to some of our internees to have that kind of recognition. But then again, it only granted $5,000. So some of our internees said, no, we're not going to accept this. This is a slap in the face. And they rejected the Mochizuki settlement and then pursued it longer to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, where we had a petition where it languished for 13 years. We just got back early this year from a hearing that was held, and it was very sympathetic, I might say. The United States government did not show up, and so we were just kind of explaining to the jurists on the commission, for the first time, we were able to talk about our story in that kind of a body. And we'll be waiting for, a ruling. But then they said, well, it's going to take time because if we do it in the normal course of things, we follow the calendar of when things were submitted. And then so they're still dealing with cases that were submitted in the year 2000. So we submitted in 2003. So we're trying to get it expedited. So how can people help? People can sign our petition, of which I have a copy in my backpack. And so asking for expedited ruling and a favorable ruling. We welcome donations. We ask you to please spread the word because this is the only way that people are hearing about it. It's not really in the school books. It's not being taught. So it's by word of mouth right now. And we have a film that helps you, so you can sell film. You can look at the film too. And the other thing, which is most important, and I can elaborate it on question and answer, is we think that there needs to be a reawakening of the spirit of justice for the ongoing unresolved World War II issues that are in the world. And for us in the United States, it's the Japanese Latin American struggle. But we also should consider all the hundreds of Japanese Americans that didn't get redress, and also the people that were used in the hostage exchange that didn't get redress, and then also the $45 million worth of education that our community and nation was promised, and we only got $5 million in the last year of the redress program. So I'll just end it there.
Leading advocate for former Japanese Latin American internees, has worked with them to document their World War II experience and also to secure United States government accountability for its wartime behavior, which included the FBI kidnapping and bringing citizens to the United States for internment in the camps. The idea apparently was that they might be traded for prisoners of war. So she'll speak about the ongoing struggle for Peruvian Japanese who were kidnapped. And one of the things which I think is interesting is this is not very well known today. I didn't know very much about it, kind of heard about it in a vague way, but I didn't realize what an important situation this was. So Grace, please.
Thank you.
He's a well-known Bay Area artist. You can see 2 of his pictures. Here's one over here on display, and then another one in the back here. So he's got two pieces of art. He's going to tell us a little bit about his own career at the Longshore Unit and his experiences on the San Francisco waterfront. And thanks, folks.
Hi. What can I say after all that? It's good to see everybody here. What can I say? Well, I was in the union for 30 years, 25 years as a longshoreman and 5 years as a ship's clerk. And I was very young when I first started, and it was really the first real job I had, and it was a great job. The longshore industry didn't have any discrimination at all, and if you did find any, you were severely reprimanded from the union. And you never heard of anything like that happening. In San Francisco, it was a great place because it had a history from the 34 strikes. And I knew very little about the 34 strike except reading about it. And being in the union and reading about these things gave me an education about labor. And I don't think there was any other union except for the Longshore Union where you can learn like you were in school. It was a great union, and it still is, I'm sure, but there aren't too many people involved anymore because the workforce has gone down. What else can I say? It's good to see all of you here, and I have a lot on my mind, but I don't know how to say it, so I'll stop here. Any questions and anything will be received warmly. Thank you.
We can have Q&A at this time. By the way, there's some cookies in the back if anybody's starving. Any questions? We must have some questions. Sure.
Larry, tell us, why was ILWU so progressive where other unions would not allow people of color into the union? What made the ILWU different?
Well, I think the leadership, for one, was a very good leadership. Harry Bridges was just a name, you know. He was our leader, but he was just the name. It took the rank and file to back up all the ideas that he had, and that's why it was a good union. And I think at that particular time, the left-leaning ideas were attacked all the time, and the ILW stuck to their ideas, and that's why we came out like we were. I don't know how else I can answer that question. Is that good enough for you? Yeah.
Pardon?
Can you talk about camp?
We talk about the camp, the prison camp life.
How is your camp life?
My camp life? Well, I was 11 years old when the war started. So to 11 to 15 years old, I was in the camp, so to speak. And the camp to me was, as a young kid from 11 to 14 or 15, it was an adventure. And I know a lot of people don't like to hear that, but you know, when you're a kid, you learn how to get along with anything, you know. And in this country, you were an American, and one thing I was aware of is that I wasn't treated like an American, although I wanted to be an American. And it was an education for me to understand that. Other than that, the camp life to me at that time was a very good time. And I don't know, I think a lot of older people may not agree with me because any kind of concentration camp doesn't feel good with anything. But we got along fine, and I survived, you know, and it was a survival, real survival. Thank you for the question. Personally, I don't know anything about that, although I've heard that those lands were very productive, and like the lands around the Alamany zone, you know, where I understand there were all gardens around here at one time, and they were truck farmers who fed the city. You know, fresh food every day. I mean, really fresh, not 2 weeks old like you get at Safeway, you know. Yeah.
Before the war, you know, or in fact, until well after the war, there was something called the Alien Land Law, which prohibited aliens ineligible for citizenship. And under American law at that time, an Asian immigrant was ineligible for citizenship. It prohibited them from owning land. So some of those Japanese American farms were put into the names of the kids who were American citizens because they were born here, but many were not. So a lot of that land was leased land. And of course, when you lose leased land, you just lose it, you know. And so that was part of the problem. There was a settlement right after the war of a few $1 million that was, everybody, even the government, admitted was only a tiny portion of what was really lost. But part of the idea of the $20,000 per person payment was that there's no way that anybody got really compensated. So just giving the $20,000 was at least a kind of a token amount. But in the Los Angeles region before World War II, most of the truck farming, most of the vegetables and fruits that were grown for the local market as opposed for export were grown by Japanese or Japanese American farmers. Some of the truck farming here in the Bay Area was also, but here Italians and other immigrant groups had sort of already gotten into that before the Japanese immigration occurred. But in Los Angeles, just as LA was becoming a big city, that was just at the time that the big Japanese immigration into Southern California arrived, so that people of Japanese descent really did get a kind of foothold into that truck farming and vegetable wholesale distribution process.
And when we're talking to kids, I don't feel like we get into it as much as I would like to, but for them to understand that part of what happened was that white farmers were threatened by the success of Japanese and Japanese American farmers. So a lot of the discrimination, predated World War II, and then there were people who benefited afterwards. So to understand it not just as this one-time kind of wartime event, and the Densho Archive Facebook page I found actually especially useful in posting articles that are related, and I've learned a lot from reading articles that look at what happened historically.
Even on a personal note, I remember meeting up with a fellow. I was probably 12 years old. I met a Japanese American who was a gardener. And why he picked me, I don't know. But he told me the whole story about, we had this farm, we had all this stuff, I had growing things, we could sell it, bring it to market. I lost the whole thing. It happened so fast. How are you going to sell it? No one would give much money because they knew we were being carted off. So I lost the whole thing. And I'm talking to this guy, I'm 12 years old, For some reason, I never forgot that conversation. I'm thinking, this is a travesty. And even at 12, I thought, man, something's wrong about that. Japanese Americans and people, Japanese background folks living in the islands. So it was pretty difficult to say we're going to put the entire workforce or half the workforce into concentration camps, because then, who's going to work in the fields? How are we going to get the pineapple that we can send to the United States for money? So, it was to a great degree economic pressure, in that sense. And, Louis Goldblatt talked about the idea that the people, were supposed to keep working because the military was there, and as this is a paraphrase, said, Lou Goldblatt said, the colonel wants his shirt pressed and washed, and it depends on the local workforce. If you put them all in camps, it's going to be, the colonel won't get his shirt pressed. Something of a paraphrase of that. So that part of it is because of the economic problem that the workforce was to such a great Japanese.
It seemed because significant numbers of people who were working in the military bases in Hawaii were people of Japanese descent, while at the same time in California they were saying that even an American citizen of Japanese descent was somehow insecure. The military, the Army commander in Hawaii, the American Army, was vehemently against any kind of internment, partly because of economics, whereas the military commander here on the West Coast, General DeWitt, was the architect really of the policy. So partly it's due to a different mindset and a different social environment, but the economics are certainly a big part of it too. I think there were about 1,500 people of the, I don't know, 80 or 90,000 people of Japanese descent in Hawaii. 1,500 people were interned. Here in California, everybody of Japanese descent. They even took Japanese American kids out of orphanages and sent them to camps because the government said every person of Japanese descent shall be sent to a camp.
During the war itself in the Hawaiian Islands, the military declared martial law. And so it wasn't a state yet, it was a province of the United States. It wasn't really a state yet. So you could declare martial law. And part of that included, okay, you longshore guys can have your union, but you can't have any contracts or any power or anything like that. You know, you can meet if you want. So the population that was organized in labor unions went way down, most accurate, such as it existed before.
Well, in terms of people who are, quote unquote, technically here illegally, people without documentation, you know, there probably isn't too many laws. I mean, you know, the government, what happens is it becomes an executive decision about how they want to enforce the law. So the Obama administration enforced it differently than Trump is. But I think the area where there is a real overlap, or where the precedent really is on this issue of the travel ban, because the administration's argument is that we, the executive branch of government, the president as the commander-in-chief, we have the right to determine when there is a security risk. And we have the right, therefore, to ban certain people from immigrating to the United States because we have decided they are a security risk. In the Korematsu case, the federal, basically Franklin Roosevelt was saying, I am commander-in-chief, and I am the one who decides that there is a security risk on the west coast of the United States, and that security risk means that all people of Japanese descent, including U.S. citizens, have to be sent to camps. I'm sorry. So the issue that the courts have to decide is, can we as a court overrule the president when the president says there is a security risk? Given the responsibility of the executive branch of the government to, you know, be the commander-in-chief and run the military, can that other branch of government, the courts, override the executive branch when it says there is a security threat? And in the Korematsu case, the majority of the Supreme Court said we can't. I mean, said we have to defer to the president. In some of these cases that have led up to the Supreme Court decision, you know, last week, individual district judges and 2 different appeals courts have said we can do that. We don't think there is a security risk here. We don't think that when the president says he's trying to ban these immigrants, he's really doing it for security purposes. We think he's doing it because he's anti-Muslim. Now the Supreme Court has said, you know, we're going to take that issue up next fall, but in the meantime, this sort of, you know, so in other words, I guess if you want to get purely legal, the same issue really that was up in the Korematsu case is in these cases, and that is to what degree do the courts and all the rest of us have to defer to the president and the executive branch of government when they say there is a security risk. I mean, Wayne Collins, from the first brief that he wrote in the Korematsu case, says, this is not a matter of security, this is a matter of racism and political expediency. And he proved to be right. But the Supreme Court in 1944 said, or at least the majority of justices said, we can't second guess the president.
I wanted to kind of respond to that too, if I could. Go for it. I think, you know, in terms of, I think in terms of the increasing incarceration we see of so-called illegal aliens, you know, now, I think what's happening is there's a criminalization of what had used to be just regulations. You know, people weren't sent to prisons. So what we're seeing is a normalization of that kind of treatment to immigrants. And then also, when you tie it to what we're learning about the mass incarceration, particularly of African Americans in this country historically, then what we see is that that not only does that kind of criminalization being applied to immigrants, but it's been applied to citizens as well. And it's becoming just more and more normalized. And then it's tied into a prison industry where private prisons make money off of this, you know? And then who knows now what government figures have vested interest in that kind of money-making venture. So then I think this is where we can really learn from our history if we have a history that is a full history. And that's what I think is a difficulty, is because we don't necessarily, even within the Japanese American community, have a full sense of our history. We're still uncovering it and trying to make sense of it and put it out there for interpretation and understanding. So then it's like, what can we glean so far from what we've learned, you know? And that's governments lie. They've been lying a long time. So when we're talking about security risks and all that, we have a long history of government lies. And on top of that, you have a history of courts that defer to the executive branch and don't reveal those lies. And then you have on top of that, a media that's complicit and cover up those lies. You know, so then it's kind of like, at what point do you say, oh, this thing is not working. Our checks and balances aren't working. So even our discussion today is kind of saying, oh, well, you know, it looks like there's a danger with Trump in the future. Well, all those things that happened during World War II, there's laws already in place for that to happen. It's already been rolling out. And it's not just recently from when Trump was president. It happened before, whether it's Democrat or Republican administration. So we're seeing the culmination of things that are becoming normal. You know, so in that sense, I think that we have to have a better sense of what our history is so that we can really learn the lessons. And this is why I like really coming to this Labor Fest thing, is that labor has such a rich history, you know, and they've been able to kind of remember it, you know, and pass it on. And there's so much we can learn about the relationship of the masses of working people and their relationship to government, to corporations, to the police force that has become more increased militarized and used against people. You know, so in that way, I think it's so important that now in this setting, the labor movement, people interested in labor history, and the Japanese American people interested in what happened in World War II are coming together, hopefully to put our histories together, and from that get a better sense of what's this way forward. Because we can't, I think it was Naomi Klein that was on one of those radio shows. She's saying, no's not enough. Just going out to a demonstration is real important, but saying no is not enough. We have to come out with some kind of a bold counter plan to what's unfolding now.
And just to add to that, I think for me and Stan, going and talking to kids, a lot of it is thinking, you know, this is the next generation. And for them to realize, like you said, you know, governments lie, the judicial branch didn't help. You know, I think ultimately what hope there is in us, right? It's we the people who have to know what's going on. It has to, you know, inform ourselves, talk to each other, and then hopefully raise a next generation who will be more critical in their thinking. And I mean, it's a tall order, but I think that's where the hope is, right?
You know, going back historically, the ILWU was really an exception. Almost all the labor movement, the California Federation of Labor, supported the internment. The Communist Party, which was a big powerful part of the left wing in San Francisco and in California before World War II. It supported the internment. Pardon? No, the ILWU is really an outlier. But one of the real problems, and in a sense, we're better off now. One of the real problems was that Franklin Roosevelt was president of the United States. Franklin Roosevelt was considered a liberal, a progressive. He was pro-labor. One of the reasons why the national ACLU did not support the Korematsu case was because they had so many ties to the Roosevelt administration. In a sense, we're lucky now because we have a guy like Donald Trump as president. We have a kind of a common enemy. But unfortunately, what you might consider to be the left, the progressives, were all split up in that period, or not split up. They were rallying around the government. And so, it was, in that sense, we're better off now because at least there's a better chance of having that common progressive coalition. Two reasons I decided to write a book about Wayne Collins. One, for a long time, I felt here's a guy that nobody knows about, and he's really an important figure. But the thing that finally got me to do it was what was happening to Muslims. It was really around 2014, 2015, particularly during the campaign when Donald Trump began coming out with this stuff. I said, we have to recapture this history. And one of the good things is that the history of the incarceration and of what happened to Japanese, it's one of those episodes in history where at least historians have really done a lot. There's been a lot of historical work, and quite properly, most of it is concentrated on what happened to the people, But there is this other history, this history of those people, the relatively few people who supported the Japanese Americans, and that part of the history hadn't really been talked about as much. So it's being published by Heyday, the same publisher as Laura's book. And it's supposed to come out next spring. I finished at least a version of it, and we'll see how much it changes are going to become.
There are places you can learn more about it. When we break, and go for cookies and stuff, I have a box there of DVDs, so you can see, get that if you want it. And it's also on YouTube, so you can see it online. And so if you just leave your name, I can send you links and that kind of thing. We're in the process of getting our website back up. So in the near future, I hope there will be a more visible thing, online presence about that. But the question you raise about why don't people know about this? This is a real important question. We've been doing this work for 20 years, if not more. So the question is, why is this history not being taught? What is it in terms of the way the Japanese American community, the broader society, how do we form our narratives? How do we figure out what's our legacy? What's important to pass on? What's worthy to remember? And then within that, especially in the context of the times we have now, it's like, if we don't have the full history, how can we get lessons from there? How can we learn from our past so that we can use that information for our benefit in the future, addressing the challenges? So if we have a limited, a skewed history, what do you think our lessons are going to be? And how that's going to inform our strategy for resistance and empowerment? And I think this is the juncture that we're at right now. And so, the question is, okay, if in U.S. history, the way we look at World War II incarceration or internment just focuses on a certain story about Japanese American experience and doesn't include the rendition from Latin America, it doesn't include and acknowledge that Germans and Italians were also interned? What does this mean for the types of lessons that we can glean, but also for the strength of the movement we can build, you know, in terms of being able to reach out to those communities and to build from that. And it's not just in terms of what it means for us in the United States, but for us to link with other people in other countries, you know, that have been affected by U.S. foreign policy. You know, so.